Good evening, everyone. My name is Jill Calate. I'm on the board of Spencertown Academy Art Center and co-chair of the Festival of the Books Committee. I want to warmly welcome you to this evening's presentation. Thank you for joining us. You may know that in a normal year, we would be sitting together outside under a big tent behind our building, but we will be meeting all our guest authors virtually this year. We are delighted tonight to have the esteemed author, Russell Shorto, with us. This is Russell's second appearance at our festival. Last time, it was a standing room only event. He is author of 6 earlier books, including Amsterdam, a history of the world's most liberal city, and the national bestseller, The Island at the Center of the World. He has had numerous articles in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Time Magazine, and is contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine. In 2009, he was awarded a knighthood from the Dutch government for his work in increasing historical understanding between the Netherlands and the US. In 2018, he was inducted into the New York State Writers Hall of Fame. His new book, Smalltime, makes a sharp turn from the narrative history into a richly detailed and very personal memoir. It delves into the unspoken fact that defined his family life. His grandfather and great uncle ran the mob in his hometown, Johnstown, Pennsylvania. In conversation with Russell this evening is David Cudaback, a former magazine editor and journalist working in Paris, London, and New York. Now, lucky for us, a member of the Festival of Books Committee. We'll have a Q&A following their discussion, so feel free to submit questions at any time via the Q&A button on the information bar at the bottom of your screen. And I can't forget to tell you about the big online book sale going on until the end of this month. Lots of goodies in our special books collection. For more information about that and the other author presentations on tap, please go to our website, spencertownacademy.org. Now, onward to our interview. Welcome, Russell and David.
Thank you, Jill. As you suggested, this book is something of a departure for Russell. We know his marvelous narrative histories, but this one is a bit different. Maybe you could share with us, Russell, what made you decide actually to write this book, and maybe give us a little bit more of an idea of what it's about.
Certainly. First of all, thank you, David, for engaging me in conversation. And thank you, Jill, for inviting me back. I have fond memories of being in the big tent. And it's just too bad we're not there. We're doing it this way, but there are upsides to this as well. As you say, this book is something different for me. It's a little detour from my my normal output. And I was hesitant to do it. And as I described in the beginning of the book, several years ago, I was home in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which is a little steel town in the southwestern corner of the state. I was home visiting over Christmas, and a group of us a day or two after Christmas were in my parents' living room, and somebody mentioned that Frankie was in town. And I said, "Who's Frankie?" And they said, "He's your mother's cousin." And I had vaguely remembered him because he had left decades before and moved to Las Vegas. He's was and still is a jazz singer. And so he had moved to Las Vegas and had his whole career there. So they suggested we go down to this little club and see him. And we did. And there was a whole group of us, relatives, mostly older relatives, people other than me who had always lived in town. There's a break in the set, and Frank looked across at me and he kind of did this and said, "Russell, you're the writer. What are we going to do about the story?" And I said, "What story?" But as soon as I said this, I knew what he meant. He said, "What story? Your grandfather, the mob." And, this was kind of, there was a little bit of a veil of silence over this. In my family, you didn't kind of talk about it too openly. So I felt these other people around me sort of cringe. But that was because they had stayed in town and they'd kind of kept that little we don't talk about it vibe. Frank, because he had left 50 years earlier or so, to him, these were golden memories. It turned out, I later discovered, he had worked for my grandfather, for the boys, as they said. He was a numbers runner and he ran a pool hall. So to him, these were just great memories. So he put that in my head, that notion. At the time I was living in Amsterdam, and I kind of pushed him away, said, Frank, I write stories set hundreds of years ago that are all nonfiction and heavily researched and footnoted. This isn't my kind of thing. But it stayed with me. And I eventually contacted him. I said, I'm thinking of seeing what's there. So I planned a week trip home just to see what was there. And he said, okay, look me up. I got there, I called him, and he said to meet him at his hangout. His hangout was, and still is, Panera Bread. And I got there, and I sat down with him, and I turned on my recorder on my phone, and he started talking. And soon as he's talking, another little old Italian guy comes up, and then another and another. And soon there were 8 of them around. He had put out the word. And no joke, David, 4 hours later, I hit stop on the recorder. And at first, some of them, didn't want to talk because you don't talk about this stuff. But then once they got going, they just kept rolling. And it was all these stories about this remarkable thing that I had dim awareness of, which is, on a broad canvas, the small town mob in America, but it was focused on my hometown. And these guys were the young guys who had looked up to my grandfather and his cohort and wanted to be them. And so they they had soaked everything in, and they had all these stories to tell. But then even with that, I was really intrigued. But I was very aware as they were talking, these are old guys' memories. I write nonfiction. I'm not going to just, spin these golden tales. I want to be able to ground things. So then I started doing the next step, which is what I'm more familiar with, and that is going to the library, going to the police records, going to the county courthouse, and getting the documentation. And lo and behold, I could see how it supported what they were saying. And that's by that point, I was hooked. I was going to write something that was quite different from what I'd done before.
Did you find, you're going to forgive me, I have to put on my glasses and there's a terrible reflection.
Sure.
But at a certain point, you write that you had to set personal baggage aside. Don't look for my grandfather, look for the historical person. My question is, intellectually and emotionally, was this a challenge? Because you're doing something completely different.
It was a challenge. There were several stages to me realizing that if I'm going to write something that's so close to me, that's about my family, it's about my namesake. I was named after my grandfather. And there was a lot of, I was the person between my grandfather, who is dead, and me, was my father. And it took me a while to realize I was going to have to be writing about my father's relationship with my grandfather, which I knew from my whole early life was very brittle. I mean, for much of my life, they didn't speak to each other. So it was going to have to get into that terrain. And slowly I realized it was going to be about my relationship with my father. So that took some, that wasn't simple. It took a period of years really for me to kind of make those realizations. And I'll tell you one thing that, as I said, I write nonfiction history. All my books have footnotes, all my books have indexes. And I had kind of backed into something that was more and more personal. And finally, after I'd submitted the first draft or the second draft, and I was talking with my editor about, the cover design and things like that, she brought up to me an index. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, she kind of was putting this on me to make the call. She said, a work of history has an index, but a memoir doesn't. So she was kind of gently saying to me, what do you think you've written here? And I said, okay, let's not do an index. So that was my final acknowledgement that what I'd written was more memoir than anything.
Mm. Could you read a passage to us so our audience gets a sense of your style, of the content?
Sure. I thought I would read a couple of pages from the middle of the book when Frank Filia, who again is my mother's cousin, who's the one that turned me on to this and kind of pushed me to work on this, is describing his childhood and how much this affected him. This is the beginning of chapter 10 called The Music. It was an Indian summer morning in 1951, and Frank Filia was 16, walking down Main Street, aglow and alive with all the possibility that this precise sunny moment held for him. The night before, he'd summoned his courage, walked into the Clinton Street pool room, and asked the boss, Yank Croco, for a job. Yank stared at the kid for a minute. He knew him. He came in sometimes and shot pool. And he said, okay, he could help him out in the place, maybe run some numbers. 100 a week, come back in the morning. And here he was on his first assignment, go down to the newsstand and pick up the racing form. Even the price of it set this work apart, 35 cents. The regular newspaper cost a nickel. Then he heads back, opens the place up, takes the covers off the tables, cleans the felt, makes sure the chalk is stocked and the cue sticks are on their racks. He opens the paper, reads through the day's races, and calls the office above City Cigar to get the scratches from Johnny Oswald, one of Russ's main guys. Johnny has been at it for hours already. By now, he knows which horses aren't running that day. Frank has to get the numbers of those horses so he can inform the bettors. First time Frank calls Johnny for scratches, Johnny corrects him on how to do it. First number, 23. Number 23. Wait a minute. Don't repeat after me. Just write them down. Okay, but I was told to repeat. You repeat when a guy's placing a bet. Guy says, give me San Francisco -3 for $20. You say, San Francisco -3 for 20. But when I'm giving you the scratches, you just listen and write. But this moment, even before he starts, when he's strutting down the street, about to start his first day on the job, is the one that stands out. I honestly think that was the happiest day of my life, says Frank, a man in his 80s, who has lived a life of considerable hardship, shot through with thin veins of sweetness, a life grounded on the philosophy of the gambler. I was 16, walking down the street, the sun is shining, and I'm thinking, I'm in the mob. He quit school on the spot. 100 a week. That was what a middle-aged journeyman millwright at Bethlehem Steel earned, a union guy with a wife and family. Frank said that morning was the first time he understood what a city was. He saw the town as a machine made of many parts that fit perfectly together, an organism. You had the mills powering it all, the workers streaming into the gates with their hard hats and lunch buckets. Over there was the Woolworth lunch counter, where all the teenagers took their dates. Next to it, the jewelry store, where a few years later, those same guys, now working in the mill, bought rings for the girls they'd made up their mind to propose to. And the realtor, where you went when you were ready to buy a house. The furniture store to fill it, the place you bought clothes and things for babies, the schools. even the store that sold you your gravestone, every damn thing fit together. And he was part of it now because the mob was a part of it. Everyone knew that. Everyone played the numbers, the pinball machines, the tip seals. They provided hope, exhilaration, energy. They were the juice. Frank told me this was why he'd pressed me to write this book. He didn't want it to die and be gone forever. That moment, his realization, the beauty of the Clinton Street pool room, of the sweating and swearing men, the throaty laughter laced with menace on a hot summer afternoon, the lumbering bodies that suddenly became artful in bending over a table, the cue sticks angling like swords, of Red Piccolo declaring he'd get a machine gun and wipe out all the motherfuckers, 300-pound Joe Bruno, who would make the guys guffaw when he'd take a couple of hot dogs with him to the toilet, the guy who thought he was a wolf man, the drunk who would stagger into the pool room and declare that he was going to invent perpetual motion. I didn't know what the hell that meant, Frank said, but I just loved it. The human thing. One time somebody took me to the ballet. I said, what the hell is this? Then all of a sudden it hit me. They're speaking with their bodies. It was a wonderful world back then, Russell. It still is.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. This book covers, roughly 150 years. It certainly goes back to a small, unimaginably impoverished village in Sicily. For me, tracing the family and their adventures, the rubber kind of hits the road in the 1920s. And it's interesting. You talk about white Protestant America being a country seething with 100 hatreds. And this goes to the tension that had built up between people who saw themselves as Americans and these millions of recent immigrants. Now, it's not hard to fast forward to see not roughly, sort of exactly the same thing happening today. The nativism, the racism, rather than don't think Sicilian, think Haitian. I mean, it's the same. Were you aware of that as you were? I mean, as you were writing, as you were reporting?
Well, I became more aware of it. I was so, as I was researching that era, and which is the era of my grandfather's coming of age. So, as you said, I went back a generation further to his parents in Sicily, and then that generation, along with them following along with millions of others from southern Italy and from many other places, Ireland and Hungary and Poland, coming to America. And, I came to see the story of the mob. And again, I'm mostly focusing on small town mob. It was all over America, every city of any size, coming out of two forces. One is immigration. You have millions and millions of people in a short time coming to take these jobs that Americans didn't want. And then prejudice. Because suddenly around 1920, it's like everybody wakes up and says, wait a second, what are all these people doing here? And it was I had no notion before of how in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan came roaring back to life. It had completely died out. It was founded, of course, to combat this threat, this perceived threat from Blacks who had been freed. But now it was resuscitated because of Catholics, because, as you said, as you quoted, Americans largely thought of themselves as a white Protestant nation. And here was this inundation by mostly Catholic immigrants from Europe. And so you had these parades down Fifth Avenue in New York and right down in Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington of the men in the whole white thing with the hoods. And it was in every little town. In my town, there were the burning crosses on the hillside. And so that was and as you say, it was eerie to be researching that and seeing how much hatred there was during the Trump administration. I mean, when there was so much of it again. I mean, I just felt like nothing has changed. I mean, it's such a feeling of despair that there is this so much antipathy toward the other and toward newcomers who are different because of whatever their religion. But that, in terms of the focus on this book, it's immigration and then prejudice. And then the next step is that next generation, my grandfather's generation, growing up amid all that. You see in these little towns, and then throw in prohibition. Here's an opportunity, here's an income stream that they can make booze and sell it because everybody still wanted alcohol, even though it was illegal. That together is how, I put together, which I had never done before, how the mob came to America and how it flourished.
Why Sicilians? Maybe it's The Godfather or whatever. We have these almost cliche images of Italian gangsters. And what was it about the Sicilians in particular that these people found so repellent?
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but Sicilians, if you ever go to Sicily, they've been invaded by North Africa and long in the past and things, so they are darker skinned. So there was that, people made a distinction between Italians. There were relatively few Northern Italians in the US at the time, but they would make a distinction between them and Southern Italians, or Sicilians in particular. And I guess that then reinforced this kind of tribalism among them. They would keep their gang together to protect themselves, which only further increased the suspicion and so on. But at the same time, there were, since the book has come out, I have gotten hundreds of emails from all over the country, not just from people with Italian American backgrounds or Sicilian American, but from Irish Americans and Polish and Hungarian and whatever else, who, said, this is very reminiscent of stories from their grandparents or great-grandparents. All of these groups did similar, a similar kind of huddling together to withstand this.
Tell us the role that I found it fascinating, the cultural role or place of alcohol, and how that fed into all this. It fed into the prejudices, but it also gave these folks an income stream during Prohibition.
Yeah, I was not aware of, I had not, read much about Prohibition. And there is this, so I thought of it as, there are, the nice little white ladies on the prairie don't want their husbands coming home drunk anymore, and so they're putting their foot down, kind of thing. There was a huge element of anti-immigrant sentiment bound up with Prohibition, and also anti-elite, anti-big city sentiment, because people in the heartland, a lot of them, looked with suspicion on these immigrant groups because they saw them, for one thing, they didn't want them there, but they also saw them, their culture, as somehow tied to alcohol. Italians with wine, and the Irish with whiskey, and I guess Germans with beer. So that was a strike against them. And also, people in cities, who thought they were so smart and clever, and who hung out in nightclubs and drank cocktails and all that. So this was a way, there was a lot of things that were packaged together in bringing Prohibition about. And at the same time, then, it became an opportunity because people of my grandfather's generation, they were the children of the immigrants who came over. They grew up with all this prejudice around them, and they grew up, on the other hand, they grew up as Americans. You know, he went to school into American schools, and they grew up being taught to admire not just George Washington and Abe Lincoln, but people like Henry Ford and Andrew Carnegie, and these titans of American industry. And what were you going to do if you were a smart kid and you weren't going to go to college, you weren't going to become a lawyer, you weren't going to become the head of a bank or something? Their options were very limited. I mean, the mayor who ran for re-election in Johnstown in the 1920s ran on a campaign a promise that he would not hire a single Italian, not even to be a street cleaner. So it was a really strong antipathy. What are you going to do if you're a kid coming up? So here's prohibition. Here's this product that everybody wants, and suddenly the businesses that had been making it are out of business. So that's how he earned his chops. My great grandmother had a still in the house, and there was a neighborhood Italian guy who organized typically women to do this. And the kids, my grandfather and his sisters, would go around the street with Coke bottles filled with moonshine and peddle it. And then after Prohibition, by the time Prohibition ended, this activity had been kind of professionalized. And they already knew what their next income source was going to be. It was going to be gambling, because just as America was very moralistic against alcohol, the same with gambling. And yet, strangely, everybody wanted to gamble. So he shifted right into that, my grandfather did. And his first arrest warrants were for running card and dice games out of the trunk of his car. So he was right there.
Illegal gambling enterprises, you suggested at one point that this simply mirrors American capitalism. You mentioned these titans, the Morgans and the Fords and the Fricks. Tell us a little bit more about illegal gambling and capitalism.
They really, on the national scale, if you look at the big mafiosi, but also if you look at these little guys like my grandfather and his brother-in-law and others, they clearly wanted to be, they were taught to admire these people, and they wanted to be like him. My grandfather's partner, his brother-in-law, had two aliases that he used. His name was Joe. One was Joseph Ford, and the other was Joseph Forbes. I mean, you couldn't get more of a sense of like hero worship or I want to be like you. And the more, this gets into the topic of the whole concept of organized crime. I read some textbooks on organized crime, and it's really interesting how the very term was dreamed up by, I guess you would say, establishment, I'm tempted to say establishment gangsters, by establishment businessmen and lawyers and so on, as a way to tar and to tarnish ethnic groups that were doing the very same thing they were doing. So what they were doing in these small towns, what my grandfather and his brother-in-law did, they paid off the mayor, they paid off the cops, they ran their person that they wanted to be district attorney. This was when they were at their height, which is exactly what big businesses do. They have lobbyists, they're called. That's exactly what they do. The way that the mob got started in Johnstown was typical of many places. A man in Philadelphia had he had been involved in a counterfeiting ring. He shielded a higher up and kept him from going to prison. This guy Joe, he served 18 months in prison. When he got out, the higher up was being given the branch office of Pittsburgh. So they were opening branch offices. And then they gave Joe the branch office of Johnstown, which is in the orbit of Pittsburgh. So they would still have a relationship. So he showed up with the franchise to open. And so what he does is he comes to town and he falls in love with this girl who works at this kind of candy store downtown, who happened to be my grandfather's sister. They then, through her, he eventually married her. And through her, then, of course, he meets her brother, who had, by this time, he grew up on the streets, knowing the gambling, knowing that the whole town at this level. So the two of them form this partnership, and that begins the mob franchise in town.
Mm-hmm. I don't remember exactly where it was along this journey of yours, but I seem to recall you saying, in reference to your grandfather, I kind of sympathized with him, or I had sympathy for him. I'm trying to remember if that was this was a very shadowy figure in your life, and it seems like that the more you learned about him, the more you understood him, and despite his many faults and many mistresses, et cetera, seemed to be becoming a sympathetic figure. Is that fair?
Yeah. As you say, I barely knew him growing up. By that time, he had been really kind of ostracized from the family. He was really pushed out. I really think now that my family did that and didn't want to talk about him much. Not so much because he ran the mob in town, but because of a couple of other things. One, he became this kind of serial womanizer and this progressively worse and worse drunk. And those two things together in combination created all these emotional scars and traumas in the family. And I, as a child, I think, you were reacting to the adults and the way they are feeling about a situation or about someone. And I absorbed that, not knowing exactly what the source of it was. So when it came to me trying to research this book and work on it, I started from this position of having this really negative, really dark impression of him, which I think is justified still in many ways. But the other thing about him, everybody who I interviewed would say, the first thing they would say is, oh, Russ was very quiet. Russ rarely spoke, and if he did, he just mumbled. And there were all these stories of him, doing something, setting up the numbers game or whatever. But it's like, well, he was so quiet, a figure at the center of it. I'm trying to write about him. How in the world am I going to do that? How can I get a handle on him? I began to do that by taking that step back, by going to the previous generation, going to Sicily and looking at him. That's what, you quoted that piece where I said, I'm not going to write about my grandfather. I'm going to write about a historical figure. And when I look at it in the stream of history with this weight of prejudice and bearing down on this family, and as it did on millions of other families, and seeing, he's a smart kid, he's growing up, this is how he's growing up. What other options does he have? So that's how I started to feel some sympathy for him. But, there were a lot of other complicating factors in terms of especially what he did to my grandmother, who I knew quite well, that, make it hard for me to truly have a sympathy for him.
At a certain point in the story, to me, the book shifted, or your point of view shifted, your perspective shifted. And it was the relationship with your father that you were beginning to understand and wanting to learn more about, right literally to the end of his life. Tell us a little about that.
The strange thing about that is that once I decided I was going to try to write about my grandfather, I tried to do it. That is, I did hundreds of hours of interviews with people in the town and in the family. And I was trying to avoid involving my father in it, which is the strangest thing because my father was my grandfather's son. He's the link between us, you know. But I was doing it, I think, because I was trying to do that because it was just so very personal. So what happened essentially is my dad, who wasn't in great health, had this real deterioration, and he was in the hospital, and we thought he wasn't going to make it. And he did. He came back, he pulled back, and there he is back at my parents' house again and shuffling around and things. And so that kind of shook me, and it made me realize, you know, by the way, I've become a big proponent of doing family history and getting people while they're still here. So anybody who's listening, you know, my push to you is find the oldest person in your family and turn on a tape recorder and get them to start talking. And, you know, I said this to somebody recently, and he said, I'm the oldest person in my family. And I said, well, turn on the tape recorder, you know, they'll be happy for this someday. So that had the effect of, you know, finally getting me to say to my dad, will you work with me on this? And he was waiting for it. He said, yes, I will. And my dad, I'm not the most gregarious person. I mean, I'm not a hermit, but my dad was always very outgoing, and that's how he approached this. He was like an AA guy who would say, I guess it's an AA mantra. He would say, "You're only as sick as your secrets." So he wanted to go down this road with me. So we, you know, the routine then is I was living an hour away from my parents. I'd come to town, sit in their living room, turn on the tape recorder, we'd talk, we'd tell stories. And they'd bring up some name that I'd never heard of. And I said, wait a second, who was that? And they'd say, oh, you don't know him? And then my dad would pull out his flip phone and, like, you know, call the guy and say, are you home? We're coming over. And so then we'd go over to that guy's house and we'd like sit out on his front porch and talk for a couple hours, and he'd, you know, suggest somebody else. You know, through that process, and as you say, at a certain point, the book shifts. And as I start to realize this is a generational story. It's an immigrant story. It's about starting with the immigrant couple who come, and then their children, their child, my grandfather, and that's the heyday of the mob in America. And then it's about the relationship between my grandfather and my father. And then ultimately, I allowed it to be about my relationship with my father. And I only just, I think, got in under the wire because then he died as I was nearing the end of research on the book. And I was, no joke, I was in the hospital as he died. And I realized what the shape of this book was. I saw how it fit together. And I mean, you know, it's like a story, true stories, nonfiction. What's a story? Everything's a story. And how do you determine it? Well, one way to determine it is when you know your beginning and you know your end. Suddenly, you've got a shape. So then I knew what the shape was, and the shape was this generational aspect.
I see we have a question from outside these realms. How did you avoid the family business? Did your father and mother push you away from it, or did you run away on your own?
Me personally, as I tell the story in the book, of the big surprise to me was I had grown up with this story in mind that my grandfather had wanted my father to come into the business, but that my father had pushed him away. And my child's mind, I guess, reasoned that what my father was doing was trying to protect his family. He had a family, he had a wife, and so he was, you know, he decided to go the straight and narrow, so therefore, in my mind, my grandfather was this dark figure, and then my father was this kind of white knight who saved us from that. Eventually, I learned from one of these old boys who I talked to that it was exactly the opposite, that my dad as a teenager had desperately wanted in, but his father would beat the crap out of him to keep him out of it. And again, there's a little when I realized that, another reason for me to have some sympathy for my grandfather. I think what he realized, what my grandfather realized, was that when he'd been a kid, there was very little choice in terms of what do you do? My grandfather, my dad, coming up in the 50s, by that time, that heavy prejudice and all that was mostly gone. So he realized that my father had many more opportunities. And so my father grew up just as he was an entrepreneur in town, a businessman. And so by the time I'm coming along and I'm growing up and it's the 70s, that was so far in the past that it didn't really affect me. It was just stories in the background.
Another question. Your writing style seems to have adapted itself to your topic, place, and people you're writing about. Is this a conscious choice, or do you just fall into that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I work hard at, I guess I work hard at not jumping in until I've developed what I think is the right tone and voice that fits the project. Because once you do, then that helps you. It helps you to engage the reader and to tell the story. Often what I've done in the past is I will use myself very minimally up front. In my book about the history of Amsterdam, I started by describing me at that time living in my neighborhood in Amsterdam, and I would take my then toddler son to the daycare, and I'd put him in the bike seat in the front of the bike, and I'd cycle, because everybody bicycles in Amsterdam, through the streets, and then I describe for the reader what the streets are like and what's going on around me, and then we go to his daycare provider and this Moroccan woman, and so I'm talking about the city today and all of its ethnicities and things. Then I back up and I'm just telling the history of the city. But having done that, that if I want to, 50 pages later, I can insert myself in again a little bit and show you kind of, I'll be your guide to the city, and you won't be surprised. So with this book, yeah, it was a whole different kind of thing because it was so personal, trying to figure out what's the right tone, and this one, the tone I took really from all these guys I was interviewing, and they're like, hey, razzmatazz, and so I adopted a little of that in the voice.
It's interesting. I'm just thinking about when you mentioned your neighborhood in Amsterdam. You've written a lot about the Netherlands, and I don't know, I just think an Italian guy would write about Italy. What's the origin of your clear fascination with the Dutch culture?
Everything I do, I've learned over time, comes back to me trying to get, as you say, origins, trying to get at the origins of something. My first book was called Gospel Truth, and it's about the search for the historical Jesus. And it was kind of, that was my way of, I had been raised Catholic, but then I left it in my teens and never really went back. But I had this intellectual fascination with everything that was behind it. And I had read a lot of the works of biblical scholars. And at some point I decided to write a kind of layman's guide that would, look at where all their circles overlapped about who the historical Jesus was. So that was me going back to my roots in one sense. I was living in New York City years later, and I was really interested in New York's roots, and New York's roots were Dutch. And so that's what got me going about that. And then eventually, after writing that book, I moved to the Netherlands, and I was living in Amsterdam. And so then I wrote what is kind of a prequel to that, a book about Amsterdam and how this unusual culture developed, very much around water. It's this incredibly collectivist culture that collectivism gave rise to these incredibly powerful individuals. And it all has to do with water and the need to work together to hold back water, because the country's essentially a vast river delta. So that has all been, I think all of these things are kind of origin stories of one sort or another.
Fascinating. Jill, have we got any other questions coming in? Or do you have any?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, here's one. Joyce Carol Oates says, through a character in one of her books, what is a family after all, except memories? And it seems to me that your book illustrates this view perfectly.
Yeah, and you've got the layer of memories that people swap when they're together at the holidays about when they were young or their parents or whatever. And I and for a lot of us, that kind of informal swapping of memories is enough. You know, it's enough to give you a sense of your family and this kind of foundation that you stand on. One reason that I've promoted or suggested to people or encouraged that they do their family history in some fashion or another is that it's obviously so much richer. Very typically, I mean, the story I just described of, you know, being raised with this one idea of what happened with my father and grandfather, and then finding out it was exactly the opposite. That's very common. I've taught courses now in writing family history, and I taught a course at Baruch College in New York, and I'd say almost every one of the kids in the workshop, you know, they started out with, here's my story about my family and about my grandparents. The one guy was going to write about his grandparents and their relationship because his parents had had a terrible divorce. His grandparents' story was this love story that he held up, you know, and looked into. And I kind of said, that's great, but be careful. And sure enough, as he delved into it and, you know, uncovered letters and talked to people he barely knew and all that, his grandfather was Scandinavian. His grandmother was, I think, from Cuba or somewhere in the Caribbean. So very different backgrounds. They met, and it turned out that most of their lives they kind of hated each other because, you know, she thought he was this, you know, emotionless Nordic type, and he thought she was this hot-blooded. But you know, he never would have known that. The student would never have known that and never have been able to plumb that had he not really dug into it and started, you know, with the tape recorder and all that. But he came out of it with a much richer sense of, you know, it's not, of course, life isn't about fairy tales and fairy tale love stories. So he really felt that this whole process gave him a much better foundation on which to like have his own love life. So it can be enriching.
How was this book received by the surviving members of your family?
Overwhelmingly, people have been supportive. I come from this very big, open, loving Italian family. And for the most part, I mean, first of all, people in my family helped a lot. They sat for interviews. They thought of other people I should talk to. My two daughters and one of my stepsons all transcribed interviews and did research. My mother would go to the library for me. My dad was instrumental. So, you know, that has been really great. There are a couple of family members who didn't want me to do this from the beginning and aren't happy about it. And I engaged them at different times in the process. And I've talked with friends who have written memoirs who say similar things. I mean, you know, the bottom line to me was, you have a right to feel that way about your sense of your family's past and your relationship to it and your privacy around it. But I have a right to tell my story, and this is my story, and it was my dad's story. That's what I was doing. So that's how I came down on that. You're not going to please everyone if you're digging into your family story. And I think you kind of have to be okay with that.
Jill, have you got anything else for us?
Get myself, sorry, it's muted again. I do have one. It's a question. After having written the book, do you have any different feelings about being the namesake? the bearer of your grandfather's name?
I think overall, I feel like, I mean, I think when I was young, because my last name originally was Shorto, Sciotto, and it was Americanized. It was, I described that process in the book. And I think early on in life, I thought, oh, I think I'll, revert my name legally to its original. But I feel like my name is kind of a summation of all of this, including the Americanization, the whole process. So no, I mean, I feel perfectly content being the namesake of my grandfather, even though he wasn't, a role model.
No concrete shoes for you.
Yeah, right. But well, since you bring that up, I should, maybe it's worth mentioning too that this book is, I mean, it's a personal book, it's a memoir, but it's really the backstory is, to me, it's kind of the story of the small town mob in America, which not many people know. And there's a lot of overlap between small town mob and what was going on in New York and Chicago and Philadelphia. But there are a lot of differences. And maybe the key difference is that it was much less violent. And I think that is partly because, maybe largely because, you couldn't, in a small town, what they were doing, they had their base of operations was a cigar store in front and a pool hall behind it and an office upstairs. There was 2 doors from City Hall. And from there, they would pay off everybody they needed to pay off. And so it was this cozy relationship, but it depended on there being an equilibrium. And had things gotten violent, had there been, concrete overshoes and all that kind of thing, then it would have forced the authorities to take action. A small town can't withstand that degree of violence in the way big cities could. And it really was about, in their case, gambling, running, manifold gambling operations, running a numbers game and craps and big shot poker games for the guys who ran the factories and the supermarkets and things like that in town, and lots of other things. They had a side business in slot machines. No, I'm sorry, not slot machines, in pinball machines, because pinball was actually a thing that everybody gambled on. So they had these, it's kind of like states today that have lotteries and they have all these different ways for you to lose your money. That's what they did. And it was all, that was their core business. So, and now, having said that, they also had, if someone welched on a bet or something, they couldn't go to the police and complain. So they had to have their own muscle. So, and I talked to people who did that too, who would go and knock someone around or knock them over the head and that kind of thing. So it wasn't all rosy by any means. And there is a murder at the center of the book, which I then go into as the book progresses, because that then, which I think makes this point, that this murder took place in 1960, and it shocked the town because everybody knew that there was the rackets and the boys in town, but it was all innocuous. And suddenly there's this murder, and it coincided with Kennedy coming into the White House and with Bobby Kennedy being appointed Attorney General, and he had come in on this campaign to clean up the mob in America. So suddenly you have the Attorney General in Washington on the phone with the mayor of this little town, and then you have FBI agents in town. So that really, this murder kind of spells the beginning of the end. That was the end of things. I mean, it went on for a number of years after that, but their heyday really ended then.
What's, I guess, ironic is that Pippi, who was the murdered man,
yeah,
he wasn't rubbed out by the mob at all. It doesn't sound like.
Oh, I don't know about that. It was unsolved. So Pippi was a bookie who booked sports. He had worked for Russ, for my grandfather, but then he would go off and work on his own. Then apparently he would go off and work for the boys in either Greensburg or New Kensington, so nearby communities. And so they had the mob had things divided up, and you had territories, but the lines weren't fixed, and there was always tension between neighboring gangs. So one theory on what happened to Pippi, he was stabbed in the chest with what seemed to be an ice pick. So, kind of right out of central casting, all of this. One theory is that it was in this turf war that was taking place between the Johnstown people and one of these other nearby areas. That's where Pippi got himself mixed up. So we don't know that, but that's what could have been.
Gotcha. Of course, it's marvelous the way you end. With I can't even remember his name. The sociopath who everybody assumed killed Pippi, and I didn't do it.
Yeah. No, of course he's going to say he didn't do it.
Right.
I tracked him down in a nursing home in Florida. I spent a lot of time in nursing homes working on this book. Yeah, he was quite a character. And he was the guy who everybody said, and he was one of the enforcers for Russ and Joe. That whole story ends up, even though this is really about my family, that story ends up becoming central to the rise and fall of the mob in that town.
Yeah. So you mentioned just before we started that you were working on something interesting, and I think that people in the audience might like to hear about where you're heading.
Sure. The book I'm most known for, The Island at the Center of the World, is about the Dutch founding of New Amsterdam, the colony of New Netherland that then became New York. For a long time, I've had it in mind to write a kind of sequel to that. So the book I'm working on now will really focus on the English takeover. And I see it almost as being kind of like a play with the English ships in the harbor and the Dutch are in the tip of Manhattan in the fort. And there's this, the messengers coming back and forth, and there's this standoff. And then we pull back to what's going on in London. We pull back to what's going on in Amsterdam. We are looking at the wider story we're looking at slaves on the ground in the colony, and we're going to West Africa, and we're seeing how that is building. But then we keep coming back to this standoff. So it's really that little drama around which so much American history turns. Once that happens, once the English take over, they basically have their 13 colonies, and everything then that we all studied as kids moves forward. But it needed that. Right.
Fascinating. Well, we need to round up. Thank you so much. It's nice to hear where you've been and where you're going. I encourage the audience. Thank you, first of all, for coming, everyone that's out there. I encourage you to read this book. It's really a great read. Interesting, funny, touching, sad in some ways, and very informative, the cultural setting that it takes place in. We're happy that you joined us today. Please come again. We have more fine authors with us this coming weekend and into next week. So thank you, Russell. Thank you, David, so much for being with us. It's fascinating. And please come again. We welcome you. So on behalf of thank you, everyone, on behalf of the Spencertown Academy Art Center. Good night.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, David. And I hope to be able to do it in the tent next time.
I hope so too.
All right.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.